From wearing the colors of half a dozen outlaw biker clubs, founding multiple, having connections with the mafia, and even killing a Hells Angels, Frank Lenti is a veteran outlaw biker who's seen it all. The story begins in Woodbridge, Ontario, where Frank was born to Italian immigrant parents. Unfortunately, there is very little public information about his childhood life. He seemed to have just popped into existence from thin air, and the very first time we saw him was on Bernie Gwynden's side as a Satan's Choice outlaw biker. According to crime journalists, Frank's life as a Satan's Choice was quite dull and uneventful. Although he was an ambitious man, he never rose beyond the rank of prospect, which many believe to be his main reason for leaving the club in 1978 and joining the rebels. However, he didn't leave empty-handed. During his time with Satan's Choice, he became good friends with Cecile Kirby, a man who would go on to become one of the most dangerous and active assassins of the 1970s underworld. Kirby had a long career, and in large part, had Frank Lenti and his mafioso connections to thank for it. In fact, sources mention that it was Frank who first recommended Kirby as a hitman to Toronto Mafia boss Cosimo Comiso. Specifically, he highlighted his friend's lethal skills with bombs and guns. However, he also warned Cosimo to not completely trust Kirby because he was of non-Italian descent, saying, "Remember, he is not one of us." Although Lenti had many connections with Canadian mafiosi, even being friends with several bosses including Dominique Musitano of the Hamilton Musitano crime family, he was never one of them. According to Kirby, he was only once involved in a $1 million burglary sometime in 1977 in which he recruited him. Through the years, Lenti had insisted that he always was and always will be an outlaw biker. Besides wild house parties and drinking sprees, there wasn't much to comment about Lenti's short life as a rebel. Nonetheless, he did make friends with Gennaro Jimmy Rosso, who together founded the first Rebels chapter in Toronto. This was sometime in mid-1978. Things eventually stagnated, and after only less than a year as Rebels, the two figured it was time to start their own thing. A move that undoubtedly marked the unofficial beginning of Lenti's legendary career. In 1979, somewhere in the streets of Woodbridge, Ontario, the two ex-rebels laid the foundation of the Loners Outlaw Motorcycle Club. Lenti even took it upon himself to design the club's iconic patch, featuring a half-werewolf, half-horned skull creature. The Loners patch garnered attention from media outlets that described it as rather elaborate and bizarre. The Loners were not like all other clubs present in Ontario at the time. They were different, and that's how Lenti wanted it. As club founder and chief recruit, he had a preference for fellow Italian-Canadian bikers. If you fit the description, then you were good to go. Additionally, the club also favored those from more privileged middle-class families, a distinction that did not sit well with other bikers that often mocked them as the losers because of their perceived high stuck-up nature. However, Rosso and Frank didn't let the hate get to them, and instead, like a plague, the Loners grew much faster than anticipated, and by the start of the 1980s, they already had other chapters in Toronto, Woodbridge, Richmond Hill, Windsor, and London. With such growth, you'd expect everything to go well. However, sometime in 1981, there was trouble in the Loners' ranks. More specifically, one of its esteemed founders, Frank Lenti, was accused of stealing from the club. According to gang experts, things got so bad that he was expelled and forced out onto the streets. It also didn't help that he was also rather authoritarian, known for losing his head whenever things didn't go his way. With nowhere to go, some sources claimed he decided to start a new life in Italy. However, Frank would later tell an interviewer in 2019 that's not what happened. He explained that he only decided to leave for Italy after his old friend and assassin, Cecile Kirby, became a police informant in 1980. Before the decision, Kirby tipped him that he was about to reveal everything to the crown. In his own account, Frank further told the interviewer, "When he started singing, I said I'd better go take a tour and reconnect with my origins." The turn of events greatly benefited the club. Even in exile, Frank spent the next 2 years preaching the Loners' gospel and successfully managed to set up several chapters. Now this was a huge achievement because very few Canadian outlaw motorcycle clubs could boast about their international status. The Loners were among the very first. It was also in Italy that Frank first closely socialized with the Hells Angels, at the time having no idea how much they would shape his future life. In 1983, when the Kirby dust storm had finally settled, Lenti made his return to Canada and was back among the Loners' elite. The club just kept growing, and by the late 1980s, the club's membership was enormous, ranking 3rd in Ontario, behind only the Outlaws and Satan's Choice motorcycle clubs. On top of that, the Loners also had chapters abroad, 1 in Portugal and 7 in Italy. You see, despite his often critiqued anger issues, Frank was extremely charismatic and had a way of getting people to do his bidding. He was also particularly successful in 2 business models that got a lot of admiration in the biker community: a stripper escort talent agency and a tow truck firm. Nobody kept everybody in line like Frank Lenti, and if you were ever in trouble, you knew who to call. He was so good at running club affairs that sometime in June 1993, he was approached by the legendary Hells Angel, Walter Stadnick, who at the time was also coming up and getting into his prime. During the Wasaga Beach Bikers Convention, the Hells Angel expressed his admiration and offered Lenti and the Loners the opportunity to patch over. Frank didn't want anything to do with that. Instead, he reversed it, and in turn also expressed admiration for Walter's work in the Hells Angels, and instead offered them the opportunity to patch over. As expected, the Hells Angels turned down the call and left, but that's not to say they didn't agree on something. From that meeting henceforth, the Hells Angels became their primary narcotics suppliers. According to Frank, he didn't particularly like Walter Stadnick. He mentioned that Walter came across to him as arrogant, wanting to control the Loners from afar. On top of that, he told him that there were 2 police informants within his Loners ranks, allegations that later turned out to be true. Unfortunately, Frank's reign as a Loner didn't last as long as he expected. In 1994, less than a year after the Hells Angels meeting, he was again without a club. Crime correspondent LinkedIn wrote that Lenti was expelled yet again on allegations of stealing from the club. On top of that, they simply couldn't reason with the man. He repeatedly always had a bad temper. With nowhere to go and revenge on his mind, Frank Lenti founded the Diablos motorcycle gang in 1995. Note that this was not a club. True to its name, it was an entity specifically formed to wreak havoc and enact revenge. We're talking broad daylight car bombings and rocket launcher shootouts. He established the Diablos headquarters only half a block away from the Loners Clubhouse on Kipling Avenue, Woodbridge. Any outlaw biker would affirm that this was a sure act of provocation. Unfortunately for Lenti, the Loners weren't his only problem. With only a few members to its name, the Diablos also faced some heat from the Satan's Choice, who saw them as competition. Even though they only occupied a small territory, the lucrative nature of Toronto's drug market put them on the rival group's radar. Although Frank was facing threats from arguably 2 of the largest outlaw motorcycle clubs in Canada at the time, he wasn't the type to give up or be willing to discuss terms. True to his word, on July 18, 1995, he would retaliate guns blazing, throwing the whole of Toronto into chaos. According to police reports, one of Frank's men threw a homemade bomb at a tow truck owned by a loner. In response, the loners shot and wounded 2 Diablos. It didn't end there. Violence would escalate in the following days as the 2 motorcycle clubs bombed each other's chapters. In no time, Satan's Choice was also dragged into the chaos, and it seemed that tit-for-tat fighting was never going to end. This was until Lenti had his life flash before his eyes. Many gang experts and police officers couldn't believe just how lucky he was to survive the incident. On August 25, 1995, a car bomb went off on Kipling Avenue just outside the Diablos clubhouse. Frank had only just opened the driver's door when the device went off. To this day, it remains a mystery how the club boss survived. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't without noticeable injuries. He didn't lose an arm or a leg. Instead, the bomb went off with half his glute, forcing other bikers to nickname him the half-assed biker. He literally lost one of his buttocks, and on top of that, would have to spend the remainder of his life walking around with a limp. Due to that event and his ongoing weapons charges, Lenti didn't really have a choice but to abandon his vendetta. The weapons charges came after the Toronto Police Department discovered a handgun and loaded machine gun among his vehicle's remaining pieces. In his defense, he told the detective, "I was using them for my kind of people. I wasn't using them against law-abiding citizens." Just to put things into perspective, at this point, the Loners Diablos Satan's Choice biker war had gotten so bad that then Mayor of Toronto almost banned all outlaw bikers from the city. That said, she didn't, but Frank was now forced to lay low for the next couple of years. In a 2019 interview, the old boss claimed he was never out of business. In fact, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, he explained that his phone couldn't stop ringing, as many potential suitors wanted his services. He was a legend to many, and it wasn't surprising that even the Rizzuto crime family wanted to recruit Lenti. Unfortunately for them, he turned down their offer, and in the fall of 2002, he joined the Bandidos motorcycle club. Life with the Bandidos wasn't bad for Frank, but it also wasn't the most exciting. There was something about the new generation of bikers that just didn't sit well with him, and the only person that impressed him was the then national president, Giovanni the Boxer. His suspicions about the new generation later turned out to be true. During the annual and much anticipated Victoria Day weekend in May 2002, Frank was shocked to find out that only he and 3 other veteran members owned working Harley-Davidson motorcycles. To him, this was a disgrace. Victoria Day is a big deal in the outlaw bikers community. It's the start of the riding season, and it seemed that the 4 elders would have to carry most of the chapter on their bikes. It's also one of the main reasons why Frank never really acknowledged the Bandidos as a club, but a gang instead. In June 2003, he suffered another huge disappointment. George the Crash was peacefully enjoying his lunch at a restaurant in Woodbridge, when suddenly he was surrounded by about a dozen or so Hells Angels. Politely but firmly, they ordered him onto the parking lot to be beaten because he was in their territory. George reluctantly agreed and was handed the beating of a lifetime. Fortunately for him, one of his friends thought quickly and rightly called Frank on his cell phone, who promptly raced his tow truck to help his comrade. Upon arrival, he was enraged, not by the fact that George was helplessly beaten, but because he had called and reported the matter to the police. To him, this was yet another disgrace. News of the incident spread fast. Not only did other bikers make fun of the Bandidos, but it also prevented others who were initially interested from patching over. Another character who didn't sit right with Frank Lenti was Bammer Salerno, the then president of the Bandido Toronto chapter and notorious heroin addict. The experienced bikers simply couldn't answer to a leader who was hooked on drugs. Lenti himself didn't take any, not even a cigarette, as he often iterated how he firmly believed that drugs were for weak men. The relationship between the two worsened when Salerno got a tattoo similar to his. Lenti was so mad that he proceeded to mercilessly beat up the chapter president and told him to have the tattoo covered up. Weeks later, Lenti found an insulting comment about him on a Bandidos website. Upon further investigations, he traced the IP address to an area where Salerno lived and accused him of posting the comment. Those at the meeting were utterly surprised when Salerno later broke down into tears, begging Lenti, please don't gouge out my eyes as punishment. Eventually, in November 2004, Lenti had enough of the Bandidos and quit. He just couldn't take it anymore. Seeing Giovanni was addicted to cocaine and Wayne Calistine was insane, and he was tired of dealing with both of them. Lenti just quit, and there was nothing they could do about it. Unlike Glenn, a former Bandidos member, who was beaten bloody when he returned his colors, they all just stared as Lenti dropped his Bandido memorabilia. No one wanted to fight with the infamous fighter, known for his tendency of gouging out his enemy's eyes. Peter, the then crime correspondent of the Toronto Star, wrote, Lenti was a living legend within Ontario outlaw biker circles, and his resignation was a great blow to the already waning prestige of the club. He was the kind of guy who, if you wanted to fight with, he was willing to do it, no gloves. Lenti was a lion you never poked as it passed. On April 8, 2006, Wayne Calistine and other Bandidos shocked all of Canada with the Shedden Massacre, also known as the Internal Cleansing. On that day, Bandidos turned on Bandidos in what the jury terrifyingly described as a murder assembly line that left 8 dead. It was so bad that many people never thought the motorcycle club would ever survive the defamation. Frank simply couldn't stay off of his Harley-Davidson. In May 2006, he rejoined the Bandidos, but with even more aggression than ever before. This time, he was looking to become the club's national president. He wasn't only motivated to keep the boat afloat after the massacre, but actually saw a future in which prosperity was a reality. However, one man stood his path. His name was Michael Sandom. Now, Michael was in the club prior to the Shannon Massacre, and as a result, had some vet qualities to his name. However, he was nowhere near Lenti's level. In fact, Lenti never really liked him, believing that Michael was just too weird. Michael's body was entirely clean from tattoos, and that really tipped off Lenti. In his own words, I don't like him. He looks like the kind of guy that sucked up to the high school bully rather than stand up for himself. Quickly, without wasting time, Lenti thought the whole rival thing with Michael for national president was a huge waste of time. Why even bother to compete? Instead, he had one of his associates send a letter telling Michael it was time for the Canadian Bandidos to stop looking like assholes in front of the USA and get along. In return, Michael replied with an email saying, "You were asking me to throw down my patch over bullshit?" One would think that a great club civil war was about to start, but it didn't really turn out that way. as Michael was utterly terrified of Lenti and had agreed to stop calling himself President of Bandidos Canada and instead allow Lenti that honor. Edwards, the crime correspondent, wrote, "Stadnick liked to act the tough guy. As it turned out, all anyone had to do was tell him to get lost in an unfriendly tone and he would have disappeared." On September 28, 2006, just days after assuming his role as national president, the police would summon him to reveal that there were rumors that someone had placed a bounty on his head and offered him a protection offer. Soon after, news of the arrest of Hells Angels members Raymond and Mark followed. According to police informer Stephen Galt, who would later be found out to be misleading the government and giving false information, claimed the two had ordered the assassination of Frank Lenti. As many expected, the new Bandidos national president remained true to his biker code and turned down the police's protection offer. Instead, he started carrying around a handgun, saying he would get the Bandidos off the ground no matter the cost. He was ready. But unknown to him, it turned out that Hells Angels really did have his eye on him. On December 2nd, 2006, with 3 other Hells Angels, David Whitered, the Sergeant-at-Arms of the Hells Angels West Toronto chapter, pulled up to the club Pro Adult Entertainment Strip Club in Vaughan, where Lenti worked as a security manager. Although people around there, including the club's owner, Dominique Marciano, were well aware of Frank's capabilities, it appears that Hells Angels, David, didn't, and after having a bit too many drinks on his 33rd birthday, decided to threaten and provoke the legendary biker. In the outlaw biker scene, the title of Sergeant-at-Arms is often given to the toughest member of the chapter, in account of his brutality and strength. Being the man he is, Lenti suggested they finish this at the lobby, where the lighting was just right. There also happened to be a security camera in the area that captured everything. The video footage showed Lenti trying to calm down the now angry Angel, but David would have none of it. Again and again, the veteran biker tried to politely and firmly tell his guests to please go home. This was until he was rudely interrupted with a punch that landed squarely on his face. He proceeded to strike Lenti, who was laying on the ground, as the other 3 angels surrounded them, sealing any possible escape route. Lenti knew the odds were greatly against him. Believing that the angels had come to sniff him out, he slowly slipped his right arm behind his back in a smooth movement to pull out his handgun. Lenti opened fire at his attackers, wounding one and killing David, as the other 2 ran. One of them drove himself to the hospital to have his gun wound treated, as the other was later found fearfully hiding in the janitor's closet. Knowing he had just killed a man, and the police would soon launch a manhunt after him, he surrendered himself to the police the following day. He told the detective that he only acted in self-defense and that he believed David had a gun, which had turned out to be false. Lenti even explained that he had gone to the lobby of the Club Pro Adult Entertainment to have the confrontation recorded by the security camera, saying he was not looking for trouble. Unfortunately for him, the manslaughter charges laid against him stood. Perhaps knowing there was no way out of the mess he was in the fall of 2007, a statement by Frank appeared on the Bandidos website stating in an almost sad tone, "As of October 2nd, 2007, the Bandidos MC 1% Canada is officially shut down. There is no more Bandido MC membership in Canada." Lenti's statement went on further to ask all Canadian Bandidos to mail their jackets with the Bandidos patch at once to an address in Texas. On April 14th, 2008, Lenti pled guilty to manslaughter for killing David, and the jury sentenced him to 6 years in prison. The ruling came even though Justice Michael Brown acknowledged that since David had punched Lenti several times before Lenti shot him, he did have a legitimate fear for his life. Frank considered to appeal. However, the fact that he continued to shoot David even after he was laying on the ground could have been used by the Crown against him. Nonetheless, his defense did plead his case, and even though the sentence stood, the Crown dropped the murder charges and settled for a plea bargain. Some thought Lenti, a Bandido, killing a Hells Angels could have sparked a huge biker war. However, the Angels knew the veteran leader wasn't like that. Instead, they contacted his family after the ruling, agreeing that David had been out of line and that his death was justified. A police informant within the Hells Angels ranks reported that the higher-ups held Frank Lenti in high regard. In fact, he was even good friends with Angels National Secretary, Donnie, who confirmed that Frank once saved his life. 6 years later, and Lenti finally got his life back after he was released from prison in 2014. In an interview, he revealed that the experience wasn't that bad. He knew people in prison and ate plenty of eggs and cheese for breakfast. Additionally, He even made friends with some other imprisoned Hells Angels, played the indigenous circle drum, and even formed his own crew, the Lifers. Frank Lenti later rejoined the Loners after a tearful reconciliation, claiming he will only leave the biker scene when he wants to, not because he is scared. A bold statement, as not long after his release on December 20th, 2016, he suffered an assassination attempt. According to his own and witnesses' accounts, a hitman dressed in green appeared on his driveway and opened fire. It seems that Frank had incredible luck, because just after the first bullet grazed his collar, the hitman's gun jammed. Thinking quickly, Frank made a motion as if he was reaching to pull out a gun, causing the gunman to run away. After being asked if he was scared, Lenti confidently replied, "The day I worry about bad guys is the day I fucking kill myself. The only thing that concerns me is if I am confronted on the sidewalk on an icy day. I might not be able to run without sliding. I'm afraid of falling and injuring my hip." When asked if he thought it was the Hells Angels, Lenti replied, "I know them. I'm 100% positive they usually come in pairs." Frank explained that he could never imagine parting with his all-black 1999 Harley Road King. Nonetheless, he stated that he planned to retire from outlaw biking soon, but still wore a jacket with the word "criminal" written on the back. Lenti always remained faithful to the outlaw biker code, serving prison sentences rather than accepting offers of immunity from the crown in exchange for testifying against other clubs, something that made him a figure of respect in the outlaw biker world. As always, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and want to see more like this in the future. Also leave a comment down below letting me know what you'd like to see next. Thanks for watching and have a good one.